So his, as I said, his prime focus is on integrated management of water resources. And he, of course, is going to have, he has a perspective, and I'm sure we would love to hear his perspective. We have Ahmad Rafi Alam Saab. He is an environmental lawyer. I think there are lawyers, very few people I think would be there would say they are environmental lawyers. So he is one of them, and he is a partner at Salim Alam, which is a law firm which specializes in energy, water, and natural resources and urban infrastructures. So I think he has got again experience in environment law, regulation, and regulatory advices to international organization, to federal government, and to the provincial governments as well. And he has been the chairman of the LESCO, the Lahore Electric Supply Company, and Lahore Waste Management Company. So without much ado, I would just ask, request uh, to please start the conversation or discussion. And I think Dr. Hassan Abbas will start the discussion. And then, of course, Ahmed Rafi Alam can join. I mean, I leave it to you. I said it's not very structured, but I think it should be like kind of a discussion. Um, Dr. Saab.
Thank you very much. I am really honored to be invited on this very important Zoom session of University of Management Sciences, Lahore, and on a very important topic, which is basically the development of water resources in Indus Basin, in particular, and in South Asia in general. Now, the development of water resources in the Indus Basin in relatively modern times began somewhere in the 1850s, when British started creating canal colonies on various tributaries of the Indus River system. The first ones were built from Madhupur headworks on Ravi River, followed by Sirhind Canal system on Satluj River, and then Ravi, Satluj, Chenab, Beas, all those rivers started getting turned into canal colonies until 1947, when the two countries became separated and independent, separated from each other and independent from the British Crown, and started their journey as independent countries on the world map. Okay, now the development of so-called water resources of the Indus Basin, especially after 1947, they started as water problem between water sharing between Pakistan and India, because in 1948, it was 1st of April 1948, when India shut down the canals leading into the irrigated area of Pakistan and asserted that this water belongs to India and Pakistan has to pay for it, and India has all the right to stop all the water flowing into Pakistan from their boundary. Now, that act of aggression, that water aggression by India back in 1948, from all the intellectual angles, from all the norms and customs, from all the laws and regulations, treaties, was an act of very violent aggression. And it had no international standing, no backing by any means, legal or moral, that a country could do that. But nevertheless, India did that, and it started a dispute between India and Pakistan. And since these two newly independent countries were quite visible on the map, and all the countries around the world, especially the bigger powers, they were very much interested in how the future of these two countries would emerge and how this part of South Asia, which was the subcontinent, how it would fare in the international relations. So there was a big global interest in the dispute, which started as a water dispute between the two countries. And then this was also the time when World War had recently finished and new global order was emerging, new economic order of the world was emerging. And at the same time, this Cold War was heating up. That communist bloc and capitalist bloc, the NATO allies and the Warsaw Pact, those things were, they were all very hot on the political stage. And unfortunately, this water dispute between India and Pakistan was caught up in the flames of Cold War. And the interest groups, both political and financial, moved in, and they started dictating the two countries how to go about solving their water dispute in a way that the two countries, they become the instruments of the Cold War. And it was David E Lilienthal, who is considered the chief architect of the Indus Water Treaty and all the works which took place as a consequence of Indus Water Treaty. Now, this guy, he was, by profession, he was a lawyer. And whatever he advised, it was followed by the two governments. It was pushed by the then Bank of Development and Reconstruction, which was later known as World Bank. There were quite a few conflict of interests in the way this whole thing was moved forward. Now, Mr. Lilienthal wrote about Kashmiri dispute and water dispute in two very famous articles. One of the articles was titled "Are We Losing India?", in which he argued that since China has moved into communist bloc after her independence, let India not do the same, because if India also drifts into communist bloc, America would be left alone without any major partners, significant partners in Asia. And America should not let it happen. And he argued that as long as Nehru is in power, he is a favorable guy, and America should establish their relations with India in the next 10 years or so. And those relationships will go for a very long time. And of course, there were quite a few things which were serving Cold War agenda by establishing good relationship with India. Then he wrote another article which was titled "Another Korea," in which he argued that Pakistan should not get indulged in a war with India, because that would create a situation like Korea, in which America might get involved. And in order to avoid that situation, India and Pakistan should solve their water dispute, ignoring any political, religious, or for that matter, cultural, or anything which are related to that water dispute. And he advised that Pakistan and India should only solve this water dispute with the help of engineers and financiers. And he argued that this is a financial problem and an engineering problem, and all the other stakeholders should not even bother what the engineers and financiers are doing. Now, there were quite a few conflict of interests which have been identified in the British memoirs, which Lilienthal had, and some of those conflict of interests were like Lilienthal had his own construction company working on the projects in India which were diverting waters of Pakistan even prior to the treaty. Now, we must not forget that uh, the Devian formula, on which the treaty was based, was ultimately signed in 1960, in which India was allowed to divert the waters of the three eastern rivers away from Pakistan and 100% away from Pakistan. Uh, Although the treaty was signed in 1960, all the structures to divert waters were already built between 1948 and 1960, except two major structures, which were Pong Dam and Theen Dam. All the other structures were already in place. Uh, these structures included Bhakra Dam, Nangal Dam, Firozpur Feeder, Rupar Head Works. Then feasibility studies on Theen Dam and Pong Dam had already taken place. Then Husainiwala headwork was replaced by Harike headwork. Madhupur Byas link canal was already made. Rajasthan canal was already made. So all those structures, they were already made prior to signing of the treaty. And all these structures were in violation of any international standards or any international laws which prevailed at that time. And it was Lilienthal, who himself was a lawyer, he said this thing in his articles that Pakistan has a very strong case against India. And if Pakistan goes to international court, Pakistan will win the case. But he at the same time argued that Pakistan should be prevented from going into the international court and pursue her case, which was a very strong case, and just submit to the suggestions by the financial managers and the engineers of how to actually divide the rivers and how to just create structures. Now, this is where the international laws were ignored, because international laws had the provisions where this division of water or the water sharing formula could have been much different and much peaceful than it turned out to be. Not just in international laws on water were ignored, also the science was ignored. The science of water management that starts with the very basic thing which is called the equation of continuity, which states that whatever water is coming into a system and whatever water is leaving a system, a natural system, the difference between the two is the change in storage of the system. And for long-term sustainability of any system, the net change in storage should be zero. Now, Mr. Lilienthal, he advised that all the water coming into the rivers should not stay in the rivers. He said that if the water is taken out of the rivers, it is used. But if it is staying in the river, it is not used. And if the water is flowing out into the sea, it is being wasted. So he advised both countries that both countries should build infrastructure that should take the water out of the rivers and do not let it go to the sea. Now, if the water is coming into the rivers and it's not going out, over a long period of time, that water will start accumulating in the landscape because it has to go somewhere. And if it's not going anywhere, part of it would be evaporated, but then part of it would stay in the landscape. And we ended up with major problems of waterlogging and salinity, both in Indian Punjab, Pakistani Punjab, and especially in the province of Pakistan's province of Sindh. Now today, the whole province of Pakistan, which is Sindh, is about 90% suffering from waterlogging issues. Why? Because the water that was prevented from flowing back to the sea, that was in violation of the basic principles of hydrology and science, is now accumulating in the landscape, causing all the problems of waterlogging and salinity and pollution. The projects like the unsustainable projects like LBOD and RBOD were undertaken The unsustainable projects like Saab tube wells were undertaken, but to no avail. Everything is still creating problems, and we are in a very bad state as far as the violation of the equation of continuity is concerned. Because this was the advice which came from a person who was not even an engineer, who was not even a hydrologist. And we, the both countries, India and Pakistan, in the development of Indus Basin, had been following that unscientific principle of not letting the water flow back to the sea, not letting the water keep flowing into the river courses, but just keep on building structures to keep to let the rivers run dry. And that's what the two countries are still doing. The boondoggles of projects which are also a consequence of Indus Water Treaty are like the Kishan Ganga project of India, which was kind of a compulsion for Pakistan to create Neelam Jhelum project of the same kind, and thereby they have destroyed Neelam Valley, one of the most beautiful valleys on the planet. That has been destroyed again as a consequence of Indus Water Treaty, which forced the two countries to build as much hydropower and as much storage facilities and as much dams and as much diversions as possible. And and consequently, the third thing which completely got ignored in the development, post 1947 development, was the environment. There was no provision for environmental flow left in the rivers. There was no provision for environment of any kind left in the treaty. And it is again very strange that since 1947, it had been written in many texts, it had been argued by many scientists that the groundwater resource of the Indus Basin is about 10 times bigger than the annual flow of the river. About 10 times bigger. Like if the annual flow is 200 MAF, the groundwater storage within the basin was in the tune of 2000 MAF. Knowing this thing, documented the fact, despite this thing, no project of any significance was ever advised in managing and taking advantage of the huge groundwater reserves, and everything was focused on surface water. Environment was ignored, laws were ignored, science was ignored, and consequently, today what we have, Indus Basin has the most polluted rivers anywhere on the planet. Indus River's irrigation system, both India and Pakistan, is one of the most inefficient in terms of water use in the world. And then the treaty, which was supposed to solve disputes, this region has the most disputed waters in any river systems anywhere in the world. The farmer is fighting with the farmer, the provinces are fighting with the provinces, the countries are fighting with the countries, and the dispute of water is yet to be solved. That dispute, that mistrust, and that societal discord is increasing with every passing day. And last but not the least, we have the most degraded ecosystems anywhere anywhere in the world. We have destroyed the world's sixth largest delta, which was a lifeblood not just for the delta itself, for the ecology of the delta itself, but also for the entire Indian Ocean. Deep sea fish of the Indian Ocean had depended on Indus Delta for breeding and spawning. Just to mention one of the very small things here. And then the migratory birds from Siberia to South Africa had depended on the wetlands of the Indus system. They are not existent anymore. We have destroyed Ramsar sites. We have destroyed our rivers. We have destroyed our culture. And this is what had been the development of Indus Basin especially since after 1947. So I leave it here, and let's see how the discussion goes from this point onwards.
Ahmed Rafi Saab.
Thank you, Dr. Naveed, and thank you, UMT, for organizing this wonderful conversation and for inviting myself. I've, of course, benefited from hearing Dr. Abbas, and I always benefit from listening to him. You know, there is a dominant discourse on water in Pakistan. We did a study about 6 years ago, surveying perceptions on water for the Chatham Institute in London. And we surveyed hundreds of people in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh on their various opinions on water. I was part of the team in Pakistan. We must have interviewed about 300 people. If you ask 300 people a bunch of questions on water, I assure you, and it's, you can understand, you'll get 1,000 different answers. But there were two things that everybody were unanimously agreed on, which was rare. And the first is that Pakistan is not about to reach a water crisis. Pakistan is in a water crisis. And those are 14 ki baat kar raha hu. And the second is that there were absolutely no women in decision making, either at the institutional level or the policy level, in water in Pakistan at all. And I want to use that point, this sort of finding from that survey, to highlight how the discourse on water in Pakistan has been dominated essentially by retiring or retired male bureaucrats, hydrologists from the irrigation department, or frankly, generals chipping in on national security and Indian aggression. But I tell you, if you get a bunch of retiring or retired old men, generals and bureaucrats, and put them in a room and ask them to solve Pakistan's water problems, they're going to talk about dams and millions of acres of feet in hydrological infrastructure. And while their solutions aren't invalid, the point I'm trying to make is that water is something that operates on many scales. You know, like the substance itself, if you put it into a different vessel, it adopts a different shape. And we can't confine our thinking on water purely in terms of what we can pipe or what we can dam. And I often retort back to people that, I wish I had the ability of getting some of the best poets and writers in Pakistan and putting them in a room and asking them, why don't you solve the problems of water in Pakistan? Because they would, not being invalid, their contributions would be on a different scale. And we must not forget that these scales are equally valid and should all be listened to without preference of one over the other. What we have in Pakistan is a very dominant discourse that bases itself on these hydrological interventions. Dr. Saab has given a fantastic overview of some of the forces affecting the development of water or water development in Pakistan, especially after the partition. And I agree. I would tend to say that in my mind, there are three major forces that have shaped the water infrastructure and our understanding of water in South Asia. And those would be the monsoon, colonialism, and the World Bank. And I want to spend a bit of time right now talking about the history of water law in South Asia and really focus a little bit on the colonial powers that shaped our modern understanding of water law and what Dr. Saab was saying, our inability to adjudicate water disputes. Now, the history of water law, modern water law in South Asia can be linked back to the, you could say, assumption of Sindh and Punjab by the British in 1842 and 1849. Because it was from then, and Punjab at that point included parts of what are now KPK and Kashmir. And so really at that point, we had in modern history a single political entity that controlled the entire basin politically. And so we see from that point onwards, in response, incidentally, to repeated famines, and we understand famines to be failures of governance,